as of this moment in time, I'm now recording the class, trying to get used to this new idea. Because some people can't make it or some people are sick. So just so that people can have a sense of what mindful self-compassion is really all about, I've decided I'm going to record all of them. So feel free to participate however much you want to, knowing that your voice will be on record, so to speak. And now I'm going to ask to start with a question to everybody. And if you're out in Zoom and you want to chat in, feel free to do that, or you can unmute your microphone and offer your thoughts. But I'm just wondering that even in the initial conversation last week, if anybody's noticed themselves talking to themselves in the past week, and what kinds of things you might have noticed about the way in which you talk to yourself. Anybody have anything they're willing to share about that?
I tend to notice, at least the ones that I notice are a bit more judgmental.
Mm-hmm. So you're starting to like actually hear yourself talking to yourself in that way? Yeah. A lot of times we don't even notice that we're doing it. Right. And so when people first start to consider it, they start to wake up to the fact that they're doing it. You're probably not doing it more. You're just noticing more that when you do it, and how prevalent it really is. So that's the one you're noticing. You're not noticing yourself yet talking kindly to yourself, right? Yeah. And that's, so we want to like sort of shift the percentages of that, right? So I still talk to myself in harsh ways sometimes, but I don't think it's the predominant way, and it's still sometimes the first way, but the frequency, duration, and intensity of talking to myself in that way is diminishing, and it's starting to shift. And that's kind of over time what we're looking for, is a shift with that. Noticing a common, I'm going to walk over here just so that people can hear you. So,
I'm noticing a common denominator in my negative patterns, and then a more common denominator in my positive ones. So it's altered my reality, because when I find out, especially, I notice the negative ones quicker because I look for that common denominator. And if that's what it is, then I bounce it off my positive one. And that tends to alter my reality overall.
So if I heard you correctly, you're noticing a common theme in your judgment, and when you hear yourself say that, it's causing you to like consider it, and then you're actually shifting to allowing this other voice to be the one that you actually pay attention to. Yeah. So you're like acknowledging that this habitual negative self-judgment, critical shaming voice came at you, and you're kind of like saying, yep, no thank you, and then allowing this other voice to kind of start to come in. That's excellent. And then you're noticing a physiological shift for you, and any other things that you would maybe notice that happens when you shift.
A lot less anxiety.
A lot less anxiety.
A lot less anxiety triggers, which is something I struggle with anyway. And I actually approach some things differently, go into them a little more positively.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put positive energy towards it, I get more positive outcomes.
Uh-huh. Great. So a physiological shift and a behavioral shift kind of starting to happen. And it's hard to not be anxious when you're screaming at yourself, right? Like it would be hard to not be anxious when somebody else is screaming at you. Why would we think it's any less anxiety producing when we're doing it to ourselves? Which is kind of where we're heading today, like, kind of really getting curious about the myths of self-compassion, because we actually think that it actually helps us be productive to be harsh like that to ourselves. But we really want to start challenging the thought about, is that really true, right? We want to sort of check that out. Anything anybody wants to say out in the Zoom room? Okay. Just wanting us to really, the start of change starts with waking up the part of you that can notice what you're doing. We've been inside of it just doing it so long. So we're really wanting to, like, as we walk through our day, just sort of turn the witnesser on, the part of you that can notice even so many things, helpful things, like it can notice when I'm hungry, it can notice when I'm full, it can notice when I'm in a low mood, it can notice when I'm hyper and possibly bouncing like Tigger on top of somebody because I'm a little too hyper. It can notice when I'm being critical. with myself. Someone in one of my groups last night was saying that they've really noticed that they interrupt people. And so they've sort of set their witness with a task of noticing when they want to talk over somebody. And if they hadn't noticed that, they couldn't interrupt that behavior. Now that they've noticed it and been willing to sort of just say, yep, that's something I do, and I don't really want to do that, they'll be pretty successful in noticing. So we're waking up the witness. That's the first part of mindfulness. It's the first part of any behavioral change. So I said last week that we would start with this idea of like, what are the common dominant cultural beliefs about self-compassion? Again, relying on those of you in the room with me, and folks can certainly chat in. But what do we think dominant culture tells us about self-compassion? What are some of the ideas that you think the general public might have about this idea of self-compassion?
That it's a sign of weakness.
That it's a sign of weakness? Mm-hmm.
Just silly nonsense.
Silly nonsense, yeah. Yeah. What else? I've heard like it's woo-woo, it's new agey, it's touchy-feely crap. Your own, if you need such a thing, you're weak. That's kind of, not only is it weak, but if you need such a thing, then you're weak. What else? Anything? Because these are the messages that we've heard that we haven't noticed that we've heard that would prevent us from even looking in the direction of wanting to have more self-compassion. Right? Here's some of what I came up with. It's if you have compassion with yourself, you're letting yourself off the hook. You're giving yourself the easy way out. It's kind of like, oh, don't worry, be happy. Like, you just, you're not holding yourself accountable. It's weak. It's touchy-feely crap. If I'm too kind to myself, I will lose my motivation and become lazy, ineffective, fat, low-performing. Like whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, when you have a failure moment, if you're not harsh with yourself, then that thing that you don't want to have happen will happen, right? That's like, that's a really big piece of why people are so harsh with themselves. You're not holding yourself accountable. If you have to be harsh or critical, or you'll end up being lenient and permissive. And one of the things that Kristin Neff talks about in her book, Mindful Self-Compassion, is this example of parenting, right? Like, did I say this last week here in class? I think maybe I did. I don't think I did on the recording, so I'll say it again. But this idea that, like, if a kid doesn't study well enough and fails a test, my choices aren't just to be harsh and critical and judgmental and shaming and like annihilate them, or to do nothing and to be lenient and let them off the hook. Like a solid parenting stance would be to care that they're having a hard time, that they've had a failure moment, to express care about that, and then to hold them accountable for a behavior change that would prevent them from having that in the future. Right? That's like, what we want that inner supervisor to be doing is to balance out caring that we've had an upsetting outcome, or a low moment, or a failure, face down in the arena kind of moment, and care that we circle back around and like take accountability. And so what we're actually looking for is value-guided behavior change. And so it's actually not the harshness that helps me line up with my values. Sometimes when I'm screaming at myself and I get shame-triggered, I go farther away from value-guided behavior. And what we're actually looking for is for you to be able to get balanced more quickly and then come back to the next thing you do being value-guided behavior. So if a kid wants to have good grades so they have a better chance at getting into a college or something like that, then we want them to circle back around and recommit to value-guided behavior, because the next thing you do matters in the overall outcome of your work or personal or academic success. And when we're shaming ourselves, the next thing we do is eat cake-like products or watch a bunch of Netflix. It's not necessarily apologizing, having a difficult conversation, going to someone's office hours to find out how we can do better next time. We don't do the work when we're shut down with shame. So that's kind of what we're adding. So the idea is, can you hold yourself accountable without being harsh? That's the question I want you to be asking yourself in moments. Like when you hear yourself being harsh, this question becomes very helpful. In this moment, can I hold myself accountable without being harsh or critical or shaming? And if I was going to hold myself accountable without that harshness, what would that look like? And you're asking the deeper, wiser part of you to help you come up with an answer, because that is what's going to lead you to a value-guided next step. So the new goal is actually to hold yourself lovingly accountable, right? Like to care about yourself as you're holding yourself accountable. They shouldn't be mutually exclusive. So I have these ideas that I just want to sort of plant out in your mind. Hopefully the purple will help imprint these in there. I will hold myself lovingly accountable for value-guided action, right? I will hold myself lovingly accountable to act with integrity. Like for the next thing I do to be lined up with who I say I want to be. Because often something's occurred and we're out of alignment. I sometimes say that, I try to use my hands, I can't hold the microphone, that it's a lot like opening an aspirin bottle. Like, if you're trying to open an aspirin bottle and the arrows aren't lined up, you really can't access what's inside, kind of no matter how you try. You could, like a vise, a pair of pliers, it's really hard. I've tried, I spent a long time on a Saturday once trying to open a bottle without lining it up, and how much would I have to do to get in there? I don't know why I was doing that, but I was. And that's kind of how it feels like your wisdom, your grace, your common sense, your clarity, your business acumen, like what your know-how, all of that is inside. And if we help ourselves line back up, we can access it. When you're screaming at yourself, the prefrontal cortex of your mind goes offline, which is your logic center. And so now you're trying to move forward without your logic center. That seems like trying to get that aspirin bottle open without lining up the arrows. So when we care for ourselves first, when we sort of say, this is a hard time, you made a mistake, everyone hates making mistakes, we all make mistakes, nobody likes it. Okay, let's breathe through this, let's catch our breath, let's line it up. Now what does our wisdom tell us to do? So when I make a mistake, I will hold myself lovingly accountable to circle back around and make amends. Right? You could see that, like, there's an upset, there's a centering, and then there's behavior. Because what happens is, we act out and talk to ourselves and interact with ourselves before we get centered. And sometimes it's just a pure frustration. Sometimes it's an adrenaline rush. Sometimes it's out of embarrassment or shame, like we're caught up in the flame of shame and acting out and talking to ourselves in that moment. So the lovingly accountable part is likely to increase the chance that you're going to act in a wise way. I told a judge once that I would teach classes at the jail, and as long as I could call it what I wanted to call it, and she was like, what do you want to call it? I go, smart people doing stupid shit. Because that's what I really feel like you have. A lot of first offenders are people who in a moment were dysregulated and not grounded and not centered, and they took action. And if they had had a minute to center first, they probably wouldn't have done the thing, right? I mean, isn't that like, I could say, I could be in the Breslin Center and say, raise your hand if you've ever acted before you got centered and if you've regretted what you've done. I think that everybody would have to raise their hand or they'd probably be a liar. When I participate in self-harming behavior, I will be kind and simply begin again, right? So a lot of us have a long history of behaving in ways that are harmful to ourselves. Like something doesn't go well, and then we punish ourselves in a self-harming way. And if we've decided that we want to be on a new journey to do it differently, it's in a moment when we have an upset and then have a self-critical response that we're likely to do the thing again. This is how somebody could be a gratefully recovering person at 8 o'clock at night at an AA meeting, and then get into a fight with, their partner and end up at a bar drinking before midnight on the same day, right? Because we get into an upset, something happens, we shame ourselves for not handling that better, and then in the shame storm, we drive to the bar because we're just, at that point, just looking to get rid of the pain. And so even if, hopefully we're going to interrupt that before we do the thing, but even if we've relapsed, even if that person's relapsed, it's like, in which way are they more likely to get to the next AA meeting? If they have more of this approach, like, I really blew it, I relapsed, that doesn't feel good, that's okay, it's okay, sweetie, okay, what do you need to do? Call your sponsor, right? Go to a meeting, get support. If a person will be kind and simply begin again, they're much more likely to get back to where they're going. So the vast majority of the time, they're going to be doing the recovery thing rather than the self-harming thing. But if when I do a self-harming thing, something previously determined to me to be something I don't want to do, and I do it, and then I shame myself about it, I'm likely to be out. Instead of relapsing, I'll probably go back to use, because I'm going to think that when we shame ourselves, we corrode the place that's capable of change. So while you're busy shaming yourself about that bad behavior, you're actually less likely to take helpful, positive action. Nobody's recovery is a perfect path, right? So when I notice that I've been procrastinating, this comes up a lot when I talk with graduate students who recognize, like the night before, they thought they were going to get up at 8 o'clock, have a fresh pot of coffee, and crank on that dissertation, and they're going to get so much done, and they don't get out of bed till noon, right? And so for the folks that when they get out of bed at noon, they can hold themselves lovingly accountable, they would actually be more likely to get something done that day. But when that person wakes up at noon and says, oh my God, I can't believe I wasted 4 hours, what a jerk, I'm never going to get involved, and then they're less likely to even get out of bed. And by the way, then that's more likely to turn into chronic depression, and they're more at risk of not completing their dissertation. One guy I talked to in a class, he said, this was his example, he woke up at 11:30, I'm like, then what'd you do? And he debated with himself and beat himself up and had this argument with himself for hours, never really actually did much. Finally ate some dinner, watched some Netflix, went back to bed. So what would that have been like if at 11:30 he had been able to say something more like this, right? Okay, that didn't go as planned. You were going to get up earlier. Let's be kind and simply begin again. What's the first thing I should do that would be helpful? I asked him that in class. I said, what would have the first thing that occurred to you been had you asked yourself this question? And he said, take a shower, wake up more, get away from the bed. And then after he got out of the shower, he would have, if he asked himself, okay, how can I help myself, be productive today? How can I act in a way where I would be happy with myself later? If I want to go to bed at the end of the day feeling more lined up, what would I do right now? In that kind of self-compassionate way, loving accountability, not just loving with no account, loving, put them together, he would have gotten some stuff done. Would it have been as much as if he had got up at 8 o'clock and worked all day? We don't even know. Maybe, right? Maybe he would have gotten up at 8 o'clock and gotten tired during the day. Maybe, 6 hours of focus work might have been better than 12 hours of spread out work. I don't know. What I know is because of the way he talked to himself, he didn't get anything done. Right? And this is true for all of us in the workplace as well. I will notice and gently and firmly self-correct. It's when I sort of say, yeah, that happened. You will, like last week, yeah, that happened. We lost all the folks in the Zoom room. And then, I can see how I might fix that. I will fix that. It could have been easy for me to go back and not record it last week, but I wanted to hold myself gently and firmly accountable to fix the problem. And so I did. And then I got to go home and on vacation the next day, free of heart. Right? Because I had done that, and before I came over, 34 people, 34 views. Might have been one person watching it 34 times. I don't really know. So this is kind of what, in those moments, we want you to have more of this stance, right? So something just occurred. that didn't go the way you thought it should, that you wanted it to be shiny and it was less shiny. So these are the questions I would want to put this on a coffee cup if I had one. So what? Now what? Okay, so what? That didn't go well. Okay, now what? What do you want to do about it? Self-compassion, mindful self-compassion puts you in the space of the what's coming. Like this whole, our need to move forward, right? To hold ourselves lovingly accountable as an institution, to relax into our health and well-being and move forward making changes that would ensure that we won't have the same outcome in the future, right? On every level, personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural, this is a better way to get to new. And especially if the old wasn't congruent with who you want to be. If our institution could have that frame, we would be more able to withstand some of the negative feedback coming in, and we would be more creative in resolving and moving forward effectively. How does yelling and screaming at yourself, calling yourself names, telling yourself you'll never get it right, how does that really help you? She asks you to ask yourself that question. Disclaimer, this conversation is based on the assumption that you want to be efficient and effective, right? Because, you know, if you want to be efficient and effective, you have to develop the skill. It's not like an optional thing. If you want to be high performing, if you want to perform at your personal best, this is the model that you have to move to. So I want to show you a picture. I'm going to see if I can do this. Oops. Well, that question is not really the important question there. So yeah, like he thinks that's going to make him a better pitcher, right? Let alone in that moment, let alone that he could have hurt his hand and he's a pitcher, or he could have hurt somebody else on his team. And that he conveyed that to, you know, every person of every age watching that's a, you know, that's a good way to conduct yourself. And I would also say that in many of the clips that I watched, I spent a lot of time watching that clip and watching news reporters talking about that clip. In some ways really encouraged that was passion, right? That was passion. That if you're passionate about something, it would be important to treat yourself that way. I'm just throwing it out there because there are all these dominant cultural messages that tell us we should be that physically harsh with ourselves. So anybody having any insights or questions or comments that they'd want to share? Okay, you need to be clicking that. Anything? Okay, all right. So I will keep going then. I know I talked about this last week, just again, sort of wanting to put the 6 words out there for you, because it's a framework. It's a framework that moving from an upset in a moment where you could scream and yell at yourself. If you go that path, you will not be on a journey towards moving through this framework, this 6-word scaffolding, if you will, where if you're willing to be compassionate with yourself, you're going to let yourself do these 6 things, right? You're going to let yourself acknowledge what occurred. See, because you know that, you know, you're not the only one that's made a mistake. You're not the only one that's had a failure. You're not the only one. Like you would be more willing to just acknowledge what happened, honor the emotions related to it, and then allow those emotions to pass. Right? So acknowledge, honor, and release. when I think release, I think of a breath. I think of a, boy, this situation occurred, and in the acknowledging and honoring it and releasing it, I'm like become willing to move beyond it in that moment. And then how I want to move beyond it is to relax back into my health and well-being, into the full flow of possible new ideas and possible insights about how to move forward in a healthy way. And then reflect on my values. This is like, who do I want to be? How do I want to move forward? And then you absolutely have to resolve to take action that's lined up with those values. If we just did the first ones, it would be just really, allowing ourselves to express it and sort of stay in that, kind of get lathered up in it. That's not helpful. It's required to do it, but it's important not to get stuck there. And so being able to help yourself, this is what I think of self-compassion as, helping yourself move through this whole process. Because what you want to get back to is that value-guided action. So I just really want you to try on these 6 words this week. And just when you're having a hard time, whether you created the hard time or whether the hard time was created by fate or by another person or intentionally by a system, if you deal with some offensive thing that occurs. I experienced one of those today. I'm trying not to think about it too much right now so I don't get derailed. In those moments, can you help yourself move through this framework? And yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Just keep thinking about that release. If you're in that, to use the term lathered state,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
agitated, getting to relaxation takes a lot of work in some way. Or processing. Is it about noticing that you're in that state?
Well, so if you have these 6 words like in your mind, you're going to know that release isn't the end point. And sometimes when we don't have that, we acknowledge, honor, and release it like bluff on somebody, right? So release is like not necessarily expressing all of the emotions out. It's honoring what you're feeling. Like honor is like letting yourself feel what it would make sense for a person to feel. And releasing is sort of like allowing those feelings to move through you without necessarily taking action. In the mindful self-compassion structure that Kristin Neff talks about, that would be the not over-identifying with your feelings, but not ignoring them either. She wants you to kind of be in this spot. So I see that component of mindful self-compassion practice as really being about the release, where I'm sort of like honor and release go together for me. I'm like, I could say this about what happened today. I would say, I won't tell you what happened, but I could say when it occurred to me, I felt really angry and really hurt. Like I would say on a scale of 1 to 100, I felt 100 really angry and really hurt. My old self might have like gotten lathered up and actually taken action with that. What I actually did was tell the one person on the planet that's most safe to me what actually occurred and how I was feeling. And then literally I just sort of did this. Yep. Like it's almost like the energy, I'm like letting the energy, like I'm not, like I'm going to acknowledge it and honor it. And I just have to tell you, it really sucks. And then make space for it. I'm like, I want to expand so it can move through, rather than when I got lathered up, I'd be like, blah, blah. And I saw myself almost say something to somebody and they happened to be busy and I was like really grateful, right? Because I actually want to let the rest of this happen first. I want to let the rest of this happen first. And I can't do that if I'm not willing to honor the emotions, right? So one thing I know, this is the self-compassion mantra. We're going to talk about this several times. I'm having a moment of suffering, right? You could also just say, this freaking sucks. This is not fair. This is hard. I'm having a hard time. This is not okay. Whatever. First sentence acknowledges it. I'm having a moment of suffering. The next piece is honoring it by actually understanding that it's not just me, right? That these kinds of hard things happen to people sometimes, right? I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person on the planet that had an insult or injury occur today. to them in the workplace or otherwise, right? Pretty sure there's people on campus that had an ouch happen today, either in their work or personal life. And so that helps me feel like it's not just me. And it also gives, like, I am as worthy and deserving as of compassion as I would be if somebody was in my office telling me the story and I was willing to have compassion for them. I can actually like kind of flip the chairs for a minute and just go, wow, I can just sort of share with you that that's really hard. And nobody would want that to happen to them, right? That's really hard. And then I want to like acknowledge and honor it, but just let it move through me. At which point there will be, once I let it go, I have to become willing to let it go, to let it dissipate right now. So I see release and relax as connected because I become willing to let it pass, comma, right now, not forever. Because if I let it pass forever, I'm likely not to take any action. And I don't know yet what action would be the wise action, which is why it's a good idea to not do anything until I know that. But I know that some way of being about it will be required, or I probably won't have a healthy boundary, right? So we become willing to release it in this moment so that we can relax into our, like, I think like I'm up here, I want to relax back into all the possibilities and then remember my own humanity and catch my breath. Release and relax is really like, this is where a self-compassionate gesture, this is one of mine. Oh, sweetie. Wow. Oof. You're okay. Just like if I fell down and skinned my knee and my mom tried to comfort me and say, you're okay, right? Thank you, Mom, for doing that. Like, it's my turn to do it for me in that moment. So I'm releasing and comforting so that I can relax back into my full health and well-being. At which point, I probably want to do the last two, right? What's this about? How did this go down? What, if anything, do I want to say about it? These are where some of the questions are, it is what it is, given that it is what it is, who do I want to be and how do I want to move forward? Or Brene Brown's question of, how do I want to show up and be seen and live brave in the context of this situation? That's really where you're inviting your deepest, wisest self. Outside of MSU, refer to that as your wisdom heart. Like, what is your wisdom heart, the part of you that is wise and wants to be about meaning and purpose? What does that part of you want to do? Wisdom heart parenting, wisdom heart partnering, wisdom heart business, right? And then to resolve to take action from there and actually do that. And I don't know what that would look like. So self-compassion is like, it's wound through all of this. It's a stance that you're going to take with yourself so that instead of just having an upset and being stuck and shutting down, you're actually helping yourself move through these stages. Does that make sense? Any questions about that at all or comments about that?
I don't know. Sometimes I find the resolve part is difficult in that, in order to resolve it in a healthy way, most times for both parties, that you have to almost re-enter or go back into the arena that caused you that discomfort in the first place. That's where I sometimes find myself getting stuck. I know I need to do something. I know what it should look like, but making myself go back in is
But it scares the crap out of me and I don't want to, right? Yeah. That's why I didn't choose the word action. I choose the word resolve, like to actually have some resolve about, because here's the deal. We sometimes don't take the action if, we start thinking about whether or not the action is going to work or what the outcome of the action is going to be. And so I might encourage you to think of it like less attachment to the outcome of the action and more that you want to resolve to take action lined up with your values. Because at the end of the day, you can't necessarily control how the other people respond. And that may be the situation in this thing that came up with, like, it may be that I need to say something even though nothing's going to change about it, because I know I need to honor myself and sort of say, hey, that's not cool, right? And this is why it bothers me. It may not have an outcome for the other person, but at the end of the day, I want to be lined up with me, right? And so there is stretching, because a lot of us, when we have been self-shaming, if we're really honest, we've been self-shaming, but we haven't actually been taking any action, right? Like when you don't have this framework, you're more likely to be passive aggressive. You're more likely to store it up and then throw it on somebody in an unfortunate moment. You're more likely to misuse your own power, either in the situation or on somebody else that has less power than you, like the unfortunate driver that happened to cut you off on the way home, right? So I get it, that it's really challenging to actually take the action, because that's brave. That's where the bravery comes in, right? And a lot of times we want to be brave, but we want to be brave after we're afraid. And sometimes we have to take a deep breath and be brave and afraid in the same moment. That's what Dr. Brown says. You've heard her say that, right? So, and so that's why the word resolve, like, I'm not kidding around with that. That's not a light, airy kind of word. That's where the rubber meets the road. If I want to have integrity in my marriage, I need to say, and I usually have a sentence starter that helps me, which tells everybody something important's about to be said here. It's in the spirit of authenticity, I need to share with you ... right? Like, in order for me to feel like I've been really honest with you, I need to share with you, right? So sometimes there can be some sentence starters that you get in your head, that you might be able to pull out of your back pocket to help you with that. But if you're getting that far and then you're hesitating, then that's the part you want to get some help with, right? Like, how can I actually say the things that would actually help me have integrity, right? That would actually help me provide the Spartan experience that I think I want to provide right now, which sometimes isn't popular, right? Like, is that making sense? Okay. So why is it important to shift away from self-shaming and towards self-compassion? And this is the part I'll leave you with today. But because when you shame yourself, it does corrode the place in you that's capable of change. No positive action comes when you're shaming yourself. It may happen afterwards, but it's sort of like, that pitcher needs to figure out what happened and why he threw the pitch. There's probably some learning he needs to do. Any learning he has from that's going to come after he punches himself in the face, not because he punched himself in the face, right? It's like, it's not going to knock a good idea loose in his head. I feel bad for him. Here's another thing. When you're shaming yourself, you're actually perpetuating the fight, flight, freeze response, which is actually what is taking your prefrontal cortex offline. So the way you're treating yourself is actually incapacitating your ability to have a wise response. That's why, if you can see that's startled, like you're yelling at yourself is startling yourself perpetually. And what we actually want you to do is go from startled back to calm, at which point you can access your wisdom. And so the fight, flight, freeze response is not helping you take effective action. I think I started to say this last week, but I can't really remember. But if I had 100 people in the room and I asked them if they knew what fight, flight, freeze meant, when I've done this with a lot of people, almost everybody raises their hand. We've heard it, we know it kind of, it's our stress response. We know it kind of pulls us into like a panic. But when I say, how many of you have heard of tend and befriend? Very few people. And this is my social justice comment for the day. It's interesting that the fight, flight, freeze is the reptilian response is typically seen as male, and everybody knows about it. But tend and befriend is the mammalian caregiving response, which is very feminine, and nobody's ever heard about it. So I just need to make that comment. But to say further, like this idea, so the mammalian caregiving response, for all people, regardless of gender, when you're tending to somebody, you are actually calming yourself. So when my dog is startled and I pick her up and comfort her, while I'm comforting her, I'm also calming my own physiological nervous system, right? And so while it's helpful for me to tend to you, which is what some people are like, how could you possibly listen to all those problems all day? Well, in one regard, I'm tending to people all day, so I do have that benefit happening for me. What the research is showing is that when you're willing to befriend, when you tend or befriend to somebody else, it's helpful. But if you're willing to tend and befriend you, it's like a double bang for your buck, because you're the one comforting, but you're also being comforted. And so that helps you get back to grounded way more quickly than if you take the shame route first. Shame, yelling, criticism, those harsh voices from our past that show up, they weren't helpful then, they're not helpful now. They've actually created barriers. There's nothing positive about it, which is why we want to start making this shift towards self-compassion. We're going to stop there. I will say that what I would like everybody to do before next week is to Google self-compassion, self-assessment. That should get you there. And it should take you to a very short assessment quiz that Kristin Neff did. It's also on her website if you can't find it any other way. And I'd like you to complete it. And if you do that on a smartphone, I'd like you just to take a screenshot of your numbers. If you do it on a computer, either print it out or just jot down your numbers. You won't be sharing your numbers with anybody. I just want you to be able to refer back to them, because next week I'm going to break it down, but I want you to do the assessment first. So if you could come with that done, self-compassion, self-assessment, and it should take you right to Dr. Neff's assessment. Okay, if anybody has any questions or concerns or comments, feel free to send me an email and I will get back to you. Or you can actually call my landline. It still rings on my desk. It'd be fun to see the little message light on for a change. In the meantime, notice when you're having a hard time, and in moments when you're having a hard time, two things to think of. One is, I'm having a moment of suffering. All people suffer. What's the most loving thing I can do for myself? Or think of the six word structure. Okay? All right, take good care.
All right, you too.